Regarding the regulations that surround women when they are in their menstrual periods, the Quran makes it clear that women are not expected to fast and they are not expected to say their salat or 5 daily prayers during this period or the days of their menses. This prohibition of women from praying during their menstrual periods is in Surah An-Nisa in chapter 4 verse 43. It is viewed by scholars not as a restriction in the form of a punishment, but actually part of Sharia's facilitation. It's part of Allah's rahmah and allowance or concession for women going through those days where they are bleeding. Some, however, have extended this restriction to say women cannot just pray, but they should not also go to the mosque, they shouldn't recite Qur'an, they shouldn't touch the Qur'an. This is not based on clear textual evidence, nor any authentic hadith, nor is it supported by the practice of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, not at the time of the Prophet, nor even afterwards. The Quranic verse only says, do not come unto your prayers, la taqribu salat. The extension of that to imply that therefore don't come to the place of prayer is an interpretation that is read into the text. It could mean that don't approach your prayers, could also mean don't approach the place of prayers. But before concluding on that, it would be useful to see if that is how the companions of the Prophet understood it. A number of hadith have been quoted that nothing stopped the Prophet, peace be upon him, from entering the mosque except if he was in a state of junub. And they therefore draw an analogy that if a man requires ablution before going into the mosque, then definitely a woman would. Firstly, this hadith and many other hadith that are quoted are actually deemed either weak hadith by hadith scholars or even fabricated. What we find is the Prophet, peace be upon him, allowing women during Hajj, as applied to Aisha, his wife, to perform all the other rites of Hajj during her menses except tawaf. So this is the haram of Makkah, and yet the Prophet had no problem with a woman being in the mosque doing all the other rites of Hajj, of talbiyah, saying labbaik Allahumma labbaik, and the takbir of Eid, and all those things in spite of them being in their menstrual periods. We should remember that the Prophet ﷺ allowed Christians and idol worshippers into his mosque, even though these people are not in a state of junub. The Prophet ﷺ allowed people to sleep in the mosque, men and women. There was a slave lady who had embraced Islam, and the Prophet gave her a space in the mosque where she could put her tent, and she lived in the mosque. We find among the wives of the Prophet Aisha saying that one of them was doing itikaf, in other words, a retreat in the mosque during the end of Ramadan with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and her period started. She just controlled the bleeding so that no impurity of blood stained any part of the mosque, but she herself was never impure or prohibited from going into the mosque. The same thing applies to recitation of the Qur'an. There is no text of the Qur'an prohibiting a person from reciting, nor anything in the hadith. What we find is the Prophet, peace be upon him, having allowed non-Muslims to have copies of parts of the Qur'an that were revealed at the time in his letters to non-Muslim leaders. Consequently, scholars like Ibn Hazm, Ibn Hajar, Ibn Taymiyyah, Nasruddin Albani, and a number of other scholars have felt the premise that everything is permissible except what is prohibited stands. There is nothing in the Qur'an, nothing in the authentically narrated hadith that makes it explicitly clear that it is prohibited. It is encouraged for people to have ablution before they touch the Qur'an, but it is not an obligation, it's not compulsory, and there is no sin on a person who wants to recite the Qur'an or wants to go into the mosque for a lecture, just because they are in a state of impurity, it is not prohibited. And Allah knows best, as scholars have differed on this, but it seems the evidence from the Qur'an and the Sunnah seems to make more plausible some of the arguments of those who say there is no basis for a prohibition. And Allah knows best.